Hi, I'm Jeff Schoep with my co-host Acacia Dietz here with Beyond Barriers podcast, and today's special guest is Tamara Meyer. Tamara is the child of German Jewish Holocaust survivors, and she's been honoring her family's legacy by teaching and using the lessons of the Holocaust to promote dialogue and reconciliation and do her part to repair the world. Tamara, it's an honor to have you here today, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's such an honor to be part of Beyond Barriers. I've been listening to your podcast and I'm so impressed with what you and Acacia are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Um, I know for our listeners, well, I know you took a really interesting and important trip recently, and you're back, and you haven't really talked about it a lot. So it's an incredible honor that you're willing to talk with us about it today. But could you talk a little bit about what you did and the reasons for that, and a little bit of the story behind that?
Yeah, sure. So I went to Germany just last month, less than a month ago, to honor my family in the city that my mother's family is from. Both of my parents are from Germany. But this trip had to do with going back to Görlitz, where my mother, her family, my grandparents, actually one of my grandparents was born there, and quite a few other relatives. And I've been back before quite a few times, but I was going back for a very special reason. This time I was returning this time with about 20 descendants of the former Jewish community of that city. The Jewish community at one time was about 900 people, Jewish community in Görlitz. And in the 30s, that began to dwindle as it became more and more dangerous for Jews to live there. And my family fled to Berlin, actually in 1936. The last remaining Jews in Görlitz were rounded up in 1942 and murdered. And there haven't been any Jews living in this city until a year and a half ago when my friends Lauren and Mark moved there. He is Jewish. He's a physician from Israel. And Lauren was one of the organizers of these events we had. So it was a very unusual, I was going back in a very different way than I had before. Um, I believe I can say with about 99% certainty that this was the first time the city has had this many Jews since 1942. So
Wow.
that was quite remarkable as well. There were a lot of firsts for Saxony. This city is now in Saxony, that's the state.
Mm.
When my mother lived there, it was called Silesia. And the um, the synagogue in Saxony, I'm sorry, the synagogue in Görlitz is the only to survive what we here in the United States call Kristallnacht. In Germany and Europe, they call it the pogroms of November 8th and 9th, 1938. And this synagogue was just reopened. So we were coming back to the synagogue that our relatives had worshipped. My great grandparents were on the board of this synagogue. My great grandmother headed a philanthropic organization with the great grandmother of one of the other descendants who came. We just discovered this actually rather recently. So um, this was a very unusual gathering for us and for the city.
Wow. It's
That's an
amazing.
incredible history, and I can't even imagine, having that background and going going there. How did that? How did you feel? Like, if you don't mind us asking, like how did that's a lot to comprehend. So
It's a
Right.
lot. It was a lot. I had a lot of anxiety before going. I think I always do before going to this city. I feel such a strong connection to it. For whatever reason, I seem to have a stronger connection to this city, to the building that my great grandfather built and that my grandfather had as a department store than the rest of my family. So I've been there quite a few times. But this time was both in a certain sense easier because I knew I'd be going with others. And I actually personally had an unusual situation in that I had 9 friends say they wanted to come with me from all over the world. So I had friends from England, Germany, and the United States all coming and joining me there along with the descendants. So it made me feel very bolstered. But on the other hand, I knew that I had some missions to accomplish that were going to be difficult, and um, it was hard. There was a lot, and I was there for about 10 days with a very, very, very full schedule of events and lectures and so forth. So it was a lot to manage.
I can imagine. You had mentioned participating in these dialogue groups, and some of the work we do at Beyond Barriers. A lot of it has to do with relational dialogue and putting together a lot of times victims with, or I should say, survivors with people that were victimizers and things like that. And there's an element of that in this. I know you and I have talked about it, but I think it's going to be interesting for the listeners to hear about that, because it's something that connects with what we do, and it's just so incredibly powerful, I think. And I would really like to hear a little more about the dialogue group and what you are doing with that. I think that would be really interesting for the listeners.
I'd love to talk about that. And I want to say that the conversations we've had about this in the past have been so meaningful to me, truly. I had one of my, I would say my closest friend, or one of my closest friends in Germany came to Görlitz with me. Her name is Dr. Martina Emma. She's a psychologist, and she's one of the founders of an organization called Eins by Eins, or One by One in English. And this organization brings together descendants of the Holocaust from the perpetrator and the victim side. We've had so much trouble with the nomenclature. We've called it the Nazi side and the Holocaust survivor side. Nobody's quite comfortable with any of the wording, but that's what we've been doing. I attended my first dialogue in Berlin in 1998, and that's when I met Martina. And she has actually come to Görlitz with me more times than anyone else, even my family members. And having her there with me was just an amazing and remarkable, I won't say exactly a closed circle, but something akin to that. Martina is the granddaughter of a high-placed Nazi. As you mentioned, I'm the child of 2 German Jewish Holocaust survivors. She's from Berlin. My family lived in Berlin. We've discovered that we have so much in common, even though we come from 2 very different narratives. And I think that this journey to Görlitz also touched on some of what we've done in our dialogue groups, which is to tell our stories. One of the things we do in our groups is to have each member tell their story with regard to their connection to the Shoah, the Holocaust. In Europe, it's called the Shoah. And one of the goals that we have is to dig deep and to really get true stories and tell the stories rather than the myths, because so many of us have myths around these stories, these narratives, and they go in many different directions. So I think what I mean by that is I think there's some shame sometimes in telling the true story. I think there is a sense for some people that their families didn't go through that much and they don't really consider themselves survivors or victims. And on the other side, there are a lot of people who feel as though their families were just bystanders. You know, why should we be in any way responsible for what happened? So these are conversations that we've been having now for a good 20 some years. And in fact, while we were in Görlitz, Martina looked at me and said, "Tamara, it's time for us to have a dialogue group here in Görlitz." And I think we will try to do that. It was important to me also to be in Görlitz, kind of continuing in the same vein, because the city used to be part of the Eastern Bloc, and there hasn't been that much acknowledgement of the Holocaust in East Germany, for example. For that reason also, I felt that it was very important for me and other descendants to go and tell our stories, which we did. Each of us took one of the events we had involved um, um, telling the stories of our families with photographs and so forth in a very public setting in the synagogue. Everyone was invited to that, townspeople, etc. So I think this was an important aspect of, of this trip also.
Wow.
And I just, something just occurred to me that I found kind of interesting is that while I was in Görlitz at a number of different events, various townspeople would come up to me and hand me hangers. I have one here that were from my great grandfather and grandfather's department store, one of the first in Germany. And they said that it had just been in their family for generations and they just never wanted to get rid of them. And here, would I like these hangers? So I came away with about 10,
Wow.
10 hangers, yes. So I really felt a connection in a way that I hadn't before with the people in this city. I was
It's
very
really incredible that they would have. So did they recognize you from the speaking at the synagogue, or how did they know who you were?
Well, there was a lot of they either recognized me or they had come to events and so they knew who I was. And there had been a lot of publicity in the media before we were there, and then while we were there, this was on television and newspapers a lot. I think it was throughout Germany, definitely in that part of Germany. So I guess they knew what I looked like.
That's pretty incredible, especially having that, finding those, for lack of a better word, like artifacts almost from your family history. That's really fascinating.
Yeah,
It is.
I was gonna say, like, how long ago was it that your grandfather's store was in that town? And they
So
had those since then. That's amazing.
so that's such a great question, Acacia. And it's an interesting one because the store is still there. It's a building that my great grandfather built. It's one of the largest, it's probably the first department store in Germany. I'm not certain of that, but it's certainly one of the first. It was built in the 1850s and it's about 25,000 square feet. It takes up a good part of the city block. And after my great grandfather passed away, my grandfather became heir to this building and also to the department store. Lots of Görlitzers, lots of people worked for him. I had a few people tell me that their grandfathers had worked for my grandfather.
Wow.
It was really, really touching. By the way, this building has a foundation that dates back to the 13th century, to the 1200s. So that's something that's always so unusual, I think, for Americans. This country, compared
Right.
to Europe, of course, is so new,
Mm.
at least for Europeans. This building still exists, and it was taken from my family. There was a point where Jews could no longer own property or businesses. It was from one day to the next taken. It was in a forced sale. So, my grandfather was given less than quote unquote pennies on the dollar, of course, for his just base,
Wow.
nothing. And, but ever since then, and still to this day, the building is still called Kaufhaus Totschek. Totschek is my family name.
Mm.
And in fact, I had some meetings with the people who are now planning for some very interesting projects in the building. They're working together with the new owner. And they are going to call it Kaufhaus Totschek. It's going to be a
Wow.
startup for tech, small tech companies in Israel and beyond, and they're calling it Kaufhaus Totschek. So
That's pretty amazing. I bet that makes you feel a little bit of a sense of pride, the fact that they're wanting to keep
very
your
much.
family name with it. Like, that's awesome. That is so
It meant
awesome.
yes, it meant a lot to me. In fact, they made that commitment to me that it will always be Kaufhaus Totschek, and they showed me um, the lettering will look like on
Right.
on the building and so forth. So yes, it means a lot to me. One of the things that we did while I was in Germany, and one of the goals that I had in going was to be present when Stolpersteine were laid for my family. Stolpersteine are brass blocks that are about 5 by 5, 4.5 by 4.5 inches, with the name of a Jewish person who was either around, who was either arrested, murdered, or had to flee in the last place where they lived or worked. So we laid Stolpersteine for my mother, my aunt, and my grandparents in front of the store, in front of Kaufhaus Totschek.
Wow.
And it was a very important ceremony. In fact, it was the first time I've seen hundreds of people inside our building. I still call it our building. Um, there was a lot of media present. The Lord Mayor was there, Charge d'Affaires from the United States Embassy, a number of other dignitaries. And we had a ceremony there. And then Gunther Denmig, the artist who started this project, the Stolpersteine project, it's actually, it's the largest memorial in the world. Um, these blocks now number 80 some thousand. And I know this because he told me that my mother's was the 80th thousand that he was installing. So
Wow.
it was an amazing honor to have him present, he himself present, to his, to lay these Stolpersteine and to be there with him. Um, it was very touching.
That's
And I found
incredible. Yeah.
it is. It's something that I've wanted to do for such a long time. And I've kind of had an approach avoidance to it. I wanted to do it, but it just seemed too much,
Mm.
too hard, it just, it was, there was a lot of pain for me
Yeah.
attached to this too. But Lauren Leiterman, the young woman in Görlitz, whose husband I mentioned before, and who organized a lot of the events that we had there, she and Daniel Breutmann, who is a German official in Görlitz, combined forces and made it possible for these Stolpersteine to be installed for 4 families, including mine. So it was
Wow.
very glad that I was able to be there.
So a lot of folks, there's different angles on this where some people will say, revisiting these um old histories and family histories and stuff are too difficult, and they don't do it, or they would rather not process those things, whereas there's other folks like yourself that you know engage in these type of things. And from my perspective, I feel like bringing those people together and doing these things is a healing process, and I think it's very helpful to a lot of people. But what are your thoughts on that? Is it does it work that way for you, or how do you feel about that?
Very much so. It's been very important to me to delve into my legacy. Although I have to say that I didn't do so until about 20 years ago. I grew up with the meta message that it was better not to ask questions. It was better not to talk about my background. I was also uh, given the meta message that it's best not to discuss the fact that I'm Jewish, certainly that I have this background. But I began to really want to learn more. And one of the first things that I did to kind of legitimize my connection to Germany was seek German citizenship. And as it turned out, according to the German consulate, I'm the first American to seek citizenship as part of Holocaust reparations.
Really?
And I did so
Wow.
successfully. So I received my German citizenship in 1997.
Wow.
And this was very, very meaningful to me. I'm a dual citizen now. And my parents had to help me with this. When I first brought it up, the door kind of closed, and I realized I should never bring it up again. And then about a year later, they told me that they wanted to help me because I needed their help. I needed to get a lot of documents, um, you know, a passport with the J and the
Mm.
swastika, etc. These things that, you know, most of us who have this background have, or our parents have, to prove that my parents had been stripped of their citizenship in 1936. So I was entitled to this citizenship based on the fact that in 1936, all German Jews were stripped of their citizenship. They were no longer
Wow.
citizens of any country, and my parents included. So that's that was kind of the first step I took to legitimize my claim on this legacy, on this country, to be able to say that I am a German citizen and I'm proud to be a Jewish German citizen. Soon thereafter, I I shouldn't say, this is something that's kind of interesting. I've spoken with a number of people with my background, and often, without thinking about it, when we speak about the first time going to Germany, for example, our parents are from Germany. I think similarly from Austria, but I'm thinking about Germany. We talk about going back. I'd never been
Mm.
to Germany, but I always talk about going back there the first time because that's how it kind of seemed to me. I was going back
Right.
to what had been my homeland for generations. My parents, my families had been there for many, many generations. And the first time I went back, back with my parents, and they took us to my brother and me to the cities where they had lived. They showed us the schools where they had studied. We even met a friend of my father's brother who took us around Heidelberg. My father, it was a mixed marriage. My mother is from Görlitz, and Berlin. My father was from Mannheim, so two different parts of Germany. It's kind of an
Wow.
inside joke, but uh, not so funny, I guess. But in any case, it was very meaningful to go there for the first time. And I then went to a kinder transport gathering in London. My mother escaped Germany on the kinder transport in 1939.
Mm.
And this was the 60th anniversary of the kinder transports. And it was a
Wow.
very important event held in London. And at this event, I met a woman who was like me, was a second generation kinder transport survivor who had been to a gathering of descendants of the Holocaust from both sides in Massachusetts. And she talked about it. A lot of people were very unhappy to hear this story, but I was very interested and intrigued. And when I came back to the United States, I made some inquiries and found out more about this organization. And the following year, I went to the dialogue group for the first time, and I brought my passport. It was, I guess, the first time I went to Germany or went back to Germany, I came with my passport as well. I had already received my passport by that time.
I
Wow.
find it incredibly, almost shocking that you in 97 that you were the first American that had went for the citizenship, and all those years that passed in between and nobody else from America had done that. That's incredible. And then the second thing that I had to ask about that was, for those that don't know, what is the kinder transport, for the listeners?
I was just
Yeah,
getting ready to ask
certainly.
the same question.
Sorry, I should have said
No,
something.
you're good.
Um, the Kinder Transport was a rescue mission. They was organized by the UK, by Parliament in 1938. It began on the bill passed actually on December 2nd, 1938, just weeks after after what we call Kristallnacht. And this is unheard of in Parliament, where bureaucracy was rife. You know, it took a long time usually to get anything through Parliament. But within weeks, they had established a program whereby German Jewish, Austrian Jewish, and Czech children could be brought to the UK if they were between the ages of, I think, 7 and 16, I believe. And from there, children started arriving very quickly. And we know now that about 10,000 children came from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia to the UK. My mother was one of those children. My aunt was too old for the kinder transport. She was 17. But that is how this kinder transport narrative also was not very well known in the United States till about 20 years ago. And I really made it my mission to tell this narrative and to get it into the press, get it into the media, get these stories out. And I think I was somewhat successful in doing so. And in Germany, as I mentioned, we had the first kinder transport event in the state where my mother is from, Saxony, and I'm very proud of that. I had two professors I know from the UK come with me, and the three of us had a panel where we did basically a history and then some personal narratives of the kinder transport. Told my mother.
Absolutely incredible. And I knew kinder was children, because my as I explained before, my mother's family is from Prussia, and was during my grandfather and great uncles were in the war as well. So I think a lot of people in America don't know about the kinder transport. So I think it was really incredible to the work that you've done to bring that to light, and all the survivors and people that came through that. It's just it's incredible. And I think this is just such an incredible story to hear, and your courage going back there and visiting the historical sites. I understand it 100%. I really do. But it takes a lot of courage, and you're an incredible guest, and we're truly honored to have you on the program.
Absolutely.
It is an honor for me as well. It truly is. The work that you're doing is exactly the work that I have been wanting to do and have done, using my legacy as a bridge for dialogue. And I, for that reason, I think we've shared so many wonderful conversations. So I thank you.
I was just thinking, like, what is because a lot of people, and I think these groups, these dialogue groups, and bringing people together from different sides of things is incredible for healing, and I think it's really a good thing. Obviously, it's what we do as well. We do as much of that as we can. Have you had any is your experience in it been mostly positive for the people that have gone through it, or has there been some negative blowback, or some people that have said, you know what, this isn't for me, I didn't like it, I think it's a bad idea? Or has it been overall a very good thing for most that engage with it? I guess it's kind of a three-pronged question here, but it's something I'm curious about.
Yeah, so there have been people who've walked out of these dialogue groups. I can think of three men who walked out, two of them from a very, I'm not going to name it, but a very, very well-known German family, German corporation. And their relatives were, again, very well-placed Nazis. And I think it was just too much for them. There is no judgment. If someone is not ready to do this, they leave, and that's fine. There was another man who also left, and I never knew why. I don't think he ever discussed it. He just got up and walked out. The dialogue groups that we've had have usually lasted about a week. They're very intensive, and I have found them very difficult at times myself. So I really understand how some people perhaps are not ready, or maybe never be ready. It may just not be what they what they need to do. There's also been some negative blowback here and there where um, occasionally somebody has been in a dialogue group who probably shouldn't have been there and created uh, some tension. I'll just kind of put it that way. That I've heard about these instances as well. So, but for the most part, I think they've been very positive. And that said, it's self-selective, and we're also those who are facilitators make a lot of effort, put a lot of effort into um, making sure that anyone who participates is ready and is psychologically ready for this, because it can be psychologically very stressful. So
Right. I guess kind of along the same lines with that is that, and like you said, it's something that you have to be ready on both sides to be able, because it takes a certain level of honesty and a certain level of admittance of the facts, not necessarily what we might perceive the facts to be, but what the actual facts are on both sides. And I know for some, coming to terms with certain things, like you said before, how like some are like, well, my family wasn't really involved a whole lot, so why should I have to listen to this, or vice versa. And so I think it is incredible that you are able to get both the survivors and those that the people on both sides to be able to come together and sit with one another and have dialogue. And it's so important. And I know you and Jeff have talked about it before, and at Beyond Barriers, we talk about the dialogue and how important it is that even if you're on opposite ends of the spectrum, to be able to sit and talk, because you can always learn something. And kind of along the same lines with the dialogue and being the daughter of Holocaust survivors, um, one thing that since starting to work with Beyond Barriers and everything, I've come to learn about was generational trauma, and something that I had never even thought about before. Like, we look at, say, like an abusive family or situation, and how a lot of times that can be passed down. It's different, but it's still like generational thing and breaking those cycles. Now, in your experience, have you personally experienced, and if you don't want to answer, it's all right, have you personally experienced that generational trauma? And if so, do you have any advice for anybody that might be dealing with that, as to how to maybe help cope with it? Again, that I know it's kind of a heavy question. So
I think I would answer this in a number of ways. I think, first of all, I have had a difficult time uh, considering myself as being traumatized given what my parents went through.
mm-hmm.
And this is also problematic. I think this is true of other children of Holocaust survivors I know of, who have felt that their discomfort, pain, trauma doesn't count because of what our parents went through. One story that I host a second generation dinner group that had been meeting monthly before this pandemic. But one of the women in our group tells a story about being about 10 years old and falling off her bike and having a really bad scrape on her knee, and it was bleeding, and she quickly got home and quickly cleaned it up before anyone could see it. She didn't want her parents to see it because she knew, without being told, she had this idea that she had no claim to her own pain, that her parents had been through so much also that she didn't want to worry them. And I think this is something that a lot of us have felt. I think I'm among those. I do believe that, having spoken with so many people who are doing research in this arena, and also with second generation survivors and with survivors, I've come to know so many Holocaust survivors, as well as survivors of many other horrific tragedies, such as the Rwandan genocide and 9/11. And I've met someone who was a slave. So many horrific experiences that I know people have survived. And I think that there are a couple things. I think one is that I'm a big believer in talking therapy. I think it's extremely important to talk, whether with a therapist, whether with other people who share this narrative, whether it is with friends. I think speaking about one's experience helps legitimize it. I think one of the things that I have had a difficulty with in my own life is legitimizing my own pain or discomfort or trauma. That's been difficult for me. I can say that participating in these dialogue groups went such a long way to changing that for me and to assuaging what I believe was passed down to me because of my parents' trauma, what they went through. And it's continued to be that way. I think also for me, doing this work of perpetuating, doing whatever I can do to perpetuate dialogue, to, I say, not perpetuate, but to facilitate dialogue is something that has really helped me a lot. And I think I would recommend that to others as well. Using your legacy, using your experience as a way to make the world a better place now, I think is important. I heard a number of podcasts. I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts, and I heard Josh Stepakoff. Okay, I did have it right. Talking about Tikkun Olam, which means repairing or healing the earth. And I think it is a beautiful idea in Judaism that we can maybe pass along to the rest of the world. We each have an opportunity to do our part to Tikkun Olam, heal the earth. And I think that is one way we can use some of that trauma or pain or anxiety that does get passed down or can get passed down.
You know, I just, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I just, really good question, Acacia. Thank you. Thanks.
And that the next question I had, which you just answered, was I was going to say, when you were talking about what you're doing, I was going to say, this sounds like Tikkun Olam. And I was going to ask you it's one of the few Jewish terms that words or phrases that I know, because I really like it. And it's on mission. It's on point. You know, it's something that I think a lot of people outside of the Jewish community don't know about that. Meeting the Jewish community myself, a lot of the stereotypes that I had when I was in the movement, you know, from back then, everything was the opposite, you know, what was believed or what was thought. So I thought it was, you know, that was one of the questions I had for you is share with the listening audience what that means. And you just explained it. So you were 2 steps ahead of me there, Tamara. It's really good though.
I love it too. I was listening to Josh and Muhammad on the same day, and I thought, what perfect bookends. Muhammad Ahmed, his program. I believe I've met him actually. I have to check, but I believe I've met him. I was texting you about that. We've both do some work with Parents for Peace. I'm on their advisory board, and Josh. I mean, both of them and all of us, really, all 5 of us here, the 3 of us and them and so many other people, you know, using our backgrounds to make this world a better place, to do our part. I believe that that's probably the most important thing that we can do for those who do feel that they have survivor guilt, or I'm sorry, not survivor guilt, survivor trauma or trauma, you know, see about using your narrative to teach and also to facilitate dialogue. That's certainly one of my goals.
That's really on point, and I agree 100%. I feel like it would be a lot easier to take some of those terrible experiences from our pasts and just bury it away, or never revisit that, or never think about it again. But if those type of scenarios, experiences, lived experiences, um, family experiences can be passed on and shared with other people, storying and that relational dialogue, working together, is such a healing process for people. And I think it's so incredibly moving, especially when you're sitting across from somebody, or you're meeting somebody that has went through that. Your humanity isn't going to allow you to look past that. You know, if you read about it in a book or you watch it on TV, you could go, well, that doesn't affect me. That's not here or now, or that was a long time ago. That had nothing to do with myself, or from that perspective. But when you're there and you're across from that person, this is why I think it's so incredibly powerful and healing. Is you can't look away. That's something you can't go, oh well, nope, that's not here. It's right in front of you, and you have to deal with it. And it reminded me of something else that when you heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that they did in Cambodia, and also to a degree in South Africa. What you're doing and some of what we do, it sounds like that. I always thought that was a really good thing. So in those areas, it wasn't necessarily to punish people per se, but to facilitate that healing and bring people together. I guess it's not really a question, but it's sort of a question. What is that? Would that be accurate? Is that kind of what, would it be similar to those Truth and Reconciliation Commissions?
So much so. Again, as to use your words, right on point. A lot of people have asked me, how can you forgive these people? Or, why are you trying to work for reconciliation? And my answer usually is that I'm not working towards reconciliation. I'm not all about forgiveness. I don't really know what that means in some regard. I'm not a believer in that word, in forgiveness. And I've actually had a number of former white supremacists apologize to me. And, my response has been, and actually a former SS officer who I knew in Germany, the same, tell me he was sorry. And I think that, my answer, I don't know if I answered everyone the same way, is that I appreciate that, but, whatever you or your family did, you didn't do to me personally. But more importantly, I'm not really a believer in forgiveness. I'm a believer in finding humanity in other people. And I believe that once, to your point, you tell your story, whatever that story is, and it reaches someone else, the humanity is found. The humanity in that other person is found. And it is so different from just reading about it in the newspaper. I had read so much about the Rwandan genocide, but when I met Eugenie, who spent 9 months living under a bed while her family was murdered around her, she's the only one who survived. That had such an impact on me. And I'll never forget that. I was thinking about this a little bit today. I've had a number of people say, oh, I know exactly what you mean. I think one thing that really is helpful is to realize that no one knows what anyone else has gone through. Even if it seems as though we've had exactly the same experience, we haven't. And yet, all of us are human, and we can find humanity in one another's narratives, in one another's person. We may not feel forgiveness. People do need to be held accountable for what they did or didn't do, if that's what's called for. But there is humanity in each person. And I think that finding that thread, that bridge, in Hebrew, it's gesher, communication, the bridge between two people, that is also what helps Tikkun Olam. That is what also helps heal the earth, finding that humanity. And that is definitely something that I've experienced in these dialogue groups. I've I definitely felt, as I've been kind of sorting through the feelings and experiences that I had when I was just recently in Germany, I would say that I would, that was probably one of the best things that happened there, that kind of dialogue and connection with people who were there who've never met a Jewish person before. By the way, some of my American friends have just think that's astounding. Um, I was speaking with someone who's African American, and he said, "Well, how many African Americans are there in Görlitz?" And I said, "Well, I saw a number of African American families," and he said, "Well, how many people have met African Americans?" I said, "Well, I don't know, but I can almost guarantee you that nearly almost no one in that city has ever met a Jewish person."
Wow.
So that's something that we kind of take for granted in, in this country, that we're, especially where I live in Washington, D.C., we're a melting pot with so many different cultures and people who come together. But that's not true everywhere. And this is another benefit of people telling their stories, telling their narratives. Everyone has a story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love that you just said that, because everybody that's one of my big things, is that everybody has a story. And one thing that I always say is like, well, what's your story? Like, because a lot of people think, well, I haven't been through trauma like so and so. I haven't been through this. I just had, a pretty normal life. But that's one thing I tell them is like, you still have a story, even if there isn't, say, the trauma that somebody else went through. You still have a story. So I'm very happy that you said that, because it's true. Like, everybody's got some story to tell. And that's what I guess makes dialogue even more important. And I love, love, love the fact that you said it's not so much about necessarily believing in the forgiveness and forgiving somebody else as it is finding the humanity. Like, I grew up in a Christian home, and one thing that's preached a lot is forgiveness. And I'm very thankful for that. And a lot of times people think that forgiveness is to make somebody else feel better or to make yourself feel better. But I've never heard it from the viewpoint that you just said it. Like, the forgiveness for you personally isn't the important thing. It's being able to find that humanity again and reconnect with that humanity. And that, you're going to make me cry. It's beautiful. It's very
Thank
beautiful.
you. I'll say something about that. I was a participant. I was on a panel for a couple of weeks with a group called Tikkun Long Island, and it was a restorative justice program that an attorney and psychologist had started, and he was kind of breaking ground at Truro Law School by bringing this panel of myself and a few other people around, throughout Long Island to give talks and so forth. And before we embarked on this, he wanted to put together a little booklet to send out and to give to people at these different events that we were going to be holding. And he asked me if I'd be willing to write a piece kind of as a model. I do a lot of writing for everyone else. And I said, well, what do you want it to be about? He said, well, forgiveness. I said, well, I don't really believe in forgiveness. And he said, really? I said, really? I said, maybe I'm not the right person for your panel. And he said, well, tell me what you mean. So I told him, I said, I really don't believe in forgiveness, because I think it's just a word that's flung around quite a bit. I really believe, and I told him, I really believe in dialogue and in connection and in finding humanity in another person and getting to know someone. Right. And actually, the first time a former white supremacist apologized to me, and I was the first Jewish person he'd ever really sat down with and broke bread with. We actually did break bread. We found a croissant and broke it. But he told me that he was sorry and he asked for my forgiveness. And I had to be honest, and I told him, I really want to get to know you. I'm really willing to get to know you and continue this conversation we've had. I can't forgive you because for the reasons I just brought up, you didn't do these things to me. I I'm not a big believer in that, but I'd like to continue our conversation. So I told Robert, the attorney, what I felt about and believed about forgiveness. He said, well, write about that. So I did.
Wow.
And I wrote about the, the the road to understanding is a very long, it can be a very long and arduous road. It's not as simple saying, I forgive you or please forgive me, but it's really, um, it's a long path that we have to take, I think, sometimes. In Judaism, something else I really appreciate about this religion, my religion, is that in Judaism, you can't ask God for forgiveness. You have to go to the person and ask forgiveness or make amends. And I think that for me, that is all about, again, continuing the conversation.
Yeah.
That's a really, and thanks for sharing all that, because that's a really incredible way of looking at things. And it's not so simple as just uh shooting it down, as you explained. You're thinking big picture here, and there's a whole lot going on. It's not as simple as just saying, yeah, I forgive you. It's much deeper than that, and the way you explained it was really beautiful, and I totally understand that. And I understand, you've taught conflict resolution courses, all kinds of different things. So you're no rookie in this dialogue thing. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, or some of the projects that you've done that are really meaningful besides the one that we've already discussed.
Yeah, so I'm still a rookie. I think I'll always be a rookie. In other words, I think there's still always so much to learn. And one of the things that I talk about when I've taught conflict resolution is that it's a lot easier sometimes to forgive or to find resolution or dialogue with someone who is not so close to you than it is with your own family. And I think it's and yet I think the principles are really the same. It comes down to really talking and sometimes finding that the conflict is something so much, it's just truly a misunderstanding. I was teaching a conflict resolution program for a company a long time ago, and there was a manager and an employee that were having just an impossible time working together. And we began to talk, the three of us, and we had a large group actually, so everyone was listening. And it turned out that they just had very different conversational styles. The employee was from New York. She spoke very fast paced, and she was a New Yorker. She was used to having to do things quickly, get her impressions in quickly, make a quick impression. And her manager was a woman from Ohio, and she would think before she spoke, and she was a little slower in the way slower paced, and she wasn't as animated. And it turned out that the real problem we realized was their different conversational styles. That's a simple, a simple explanation for what can sometimes be a lot more complicated than that. But sometimes just parsing out and finding, um, uh, what is at the root of a conflict can be really useful. Sometimes it is something simple. And on the other hand, what we find, for example, in the dialogue group that I was talking about, the first dialogue group that I attended, I discovered that the people I had most in common with were not the other Holocaust survivors. Actually, there was a Holocaust survivor who by the strangest coincidence, was one of my mother's closest friends from Berlin.
Oh, wow.
And she had been living in Italy, in Rome, for 60 years. And she ended up as one of the 10 participants in this dialogue group. But what I was going to say, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment here. It's an amazing thing when you bring people together and find out that the people you would least likely expect to have something in common with you do. That is a remarkable experience. And that is what I felt the first time I went to a dialogue group in Berlin, that the people I was, in a sense, most immediately comfortable with were the children of Nazis. Because I knew that rhythm, I knew that language. I am a German citizen. I was a German citizen by that point, and we kind of rocked to the same rhythm is the word that comes to mind. And actually, the first night I was in Berlin, I took a walk with one of the women in the group. She was a translator from, I believe she is from Berlin. And we're both walkers. We both love to exercise, and you just kind of needed to let off steam. And while a lot of people were, having a drink and smoking, we first needed to get out and take a walk. So we were walking around Lake Wannsee, very close to House Wannsee, where the final solution was drafted, by the way. And she asked me where I lived, and I told her Washington, D.C. And she said, you live in Washington, D.C. I want to come there. I want to go to the Holocaust Museum. Maybe I can come and, come and visit you, and we can go to the Holocaust Museum together. And I thought, I'm not going to tell her, because I had made a commitment never to go there. I never wanted to go to the Holocaust Museum, this National Holocaust Museum and Memorial here in D.C., Washington, D.C. 10 years later, she came to visit me. And just before she arrived, she said, Tamara, I really want to go to the Holocaust Museum with you. And I thought, oh no, I'm going to have to go. So actually, the first time I went to the Holocaust Museum was with the daughter of a Nazi.
Wow.
Wow.
Yes. And then a month later, Martina Emma, who came with me to Görlitz this time, the founder of One by One, one of the founders, was coming to Washington just for a day or two and staying with me. And it was this beautiful spring day. And I told her all the different things I thought we might do that day. And she said, Tamara, what I'd really like to do is go to the Holocaust Museum this year. So the second time I went to the Holocaust Museum was with the granddaughter of a Nazi. And again, you asked about, or we were talking about commonality. I think that one thing that is very surprising that almost anyone will discover once they meet other people who they are in conflict with, and talk and tell their narratives and share and bear witness to one another's stories, is that they have a lot in common.
Yeah.
Astoundingly so.
Wow.
And I think that is, it's so true, and it's so shocking, I think, to people on both sides. And just some of the people that we've met since leaving the movement, and you find those commonalities, and you find, I have more in common with this person who was a perceived adversary or a perceived enemy than I had in common with a lot of the people, or most of the people that I had been around. And I'm not just speaking for myself, but we hear this all the time from people. And I just think it's so incredible when you bring people together, that even that for the outside world that's looking in and it's hearing these stories, I can just imagine the mouths dropping, hearing you explain that, and how, it's heavy stuff, but to explain that and to hear that, I think for a lot of people, it might take a couple minutes or longer to process that. Like, how does that even work? And that's why I think it's so important to have these conversations, and why it's so incredible the work that you're doing and sharing these stories. I know it's not easy, but it makes such a difference, and it's just really incredible.
Thank you.
Well, so welcome. It means a lot to me to be speaking with the two of you. It really does. I love the work that you are doing. I feel as though we're kind of comrades here, and um, and the more that we can work together, the better. You know,
Absolutely.
here, one and one makes 10. You know? So,
Exactly.
so I was talking about being in Görlitz and participating in all these events that I'd helped plan. Many of them I'd helped plan from this country. A lot of it had been planned by Lauren Leiterman, this wonderful young woman in Görlitz in the city who made it her mission to do so. But there was also an event that occurred that I wasn't expecting and that I had a chance to participate in. And this is something that I discovered the townspeople, the city of Görlitz, has been doing since back in the DDR. We call it the GDR times, when Görlitz was part of the Eastern Bloc. And what happened was that on November 9th, which is, we call it Kristallnacht here in this country. In Europe, they call it the pogroms of November 8th and 9th. They translate it into different languages. On November 9th, people in the city gather at a gorgeous, beautiful Catholic church. And there's a ceremony held. This gathering lasted for about an hour and a half. And three different priests spoke. One of them probably from different churches. There was a female minister and two men. And actually the Lord Mayor also spoke at the church. And then one by one, we left the church. And as we left, we were given a candle in a paper cup. It was a very cold, brisk night in November. And we walked out of the church. There were hundreds of us, actually. And we all made our way slowly to the synagogue. It was about, I'd say, a half a mile walk. So for that half mile, we, the descendants, dignitaries, the police, there was always a police presence. Whenever there's a Jewish event in Germany, there are always police. Dignitaries, townspeople, people from other cities. We walked together with our lit candles till we arrived at the synagogue, this beautiful synagogue, the only to survive Kristallnacht, or the pogroms on the 9th of November, 1938 in Saxony, and one of the few in Germany to survive. We arrived at this synagogue together, a few hundred people, all with our lit candles, and one by one, people brought their candles and put them in a box with sand. And those of us who were descendants came up to kind of the top step along with dignitaries, and we just held a moment of silence together. And there was a jazz musician playing after that, this beautiful jazz saxophone player. And there was just this wonderful feeling of coming together with the townspeople, the city descendants, dignitaries, everyone coming together in such a beautiful way. And this was particularly meaningful to me, given the fact that I've been very anxious about coming to Germany, and particularly this city where a huge percentage of the population had voted for the far right-wing political party in the last parliamentary vote. So to have this coming together was just, it was a wonderful way to spend the last day that I spent this last time in Görlitz and on this trip. Thank you for asking me about it.
Wow.
Thank you for sharing that. That's incredible.
I
Acacia, do you have any other questions, or I'm going to ask the last one that I have.
You go for it. It's been
I
great.
was just going to ask if you have anything else that we've not covered, or anything you'd like to say to the audience in closing, or message of wisdom in anything. If there's something that we've not discussed, then now is definitely the time.
I think the one thing I would say is that there are a lot of us who are doing this work, and a lot of organizations we're working to make a difference. Yours is one. I also want to mention Parents for Peace. I'm on the advisory board for that organization. And I just have so much respect for the work that you're doing, that our organization, Parents for Peace, is doing to fight extremism and help people who might be radicalized um, leave hatred behind.
Yes.
It's it takes a lot of effort, I think, to confront one's past, whatever that is.
Mm.
And I think that the one thing I would say is that it continues to be worth it for me to confront or maybe explore my past, my legacy, and do what I can to use those narratives, my legacy, those stories to connect with other people and to do my little part to, as we've all mentioned, Tikkun Olam. That's what I would say.
Well, thank you
That's
very
a
much.
beautiful way to close, and we're gonna, for the viewers, Parents for Peace does excellent work as well, and we are going to link them in the description. We will link them so people can check them out, and they do great work as well. And thank you so much for joining us. I feel like we could have went on, and we might have to have you back on in the future again if you're willing. So thank you so much, and it was an incredible honor.
So welcome. I'm so honored. I'm so honored to meet you both this way. Thank you.
Thank you.